So it's my pleasure to introduce Jana Riess. I don't remember a time when I didn't know Jana, and that doesn't mean we didn't first meet some point. I think Jana resides in a kind of different sphere than most people in my life. I frequently, the expression, what would Jesus do? Jesus does some mysterious things that are just beyond me, but I can always answer, what would Jana do? And I figure it's pretty close. So Jana is a senior columnist for the Religious News Service. She received her Master's of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary and PhD in American Religious History from Columbia. Since 2008, she's been an editor in the publishing industry, primarily working in the areas of religion, history, popular culture, ethics, and biblical studies. From 1999 to 2008, she was the religion book review editor for Publishers Weekly, and she continues to write freelance articles and reviews for Publishers Weekly as well as other publications. She's the author, most famously, of several books, including Mormonism and American Politics, which she just did with Randall Ballmer, and Mormonism for Dummies. So those of you who, you don't have to be a dummy to read it, I found out. She also did Flunking Sainthood, which I still don't believe she did. And she also, that she really flunked sainthood, I don't believe she did that. And she also did the recently released Twible, tweeting the entire Bible. So please join me in welcoming Jana Riess.
I've never been introduced in quite that way before. Thank you. The phone rang almost as soon as we sat down to lunch. This was years ago, in the days before every teenager had a cell phone, when teenagers received calls at home and the whole family could then tease them about it. The call was for the 16-year-old daughter of the household we were visiting, a quiet, beautiful girl that I'd only spoken to a few times. After Amanda got up from the table to take the call, I made a joking comment to her mom about how the phone must be ringing off the hook these days for her gorgeous daughter. I was surprised by the tender expression that crossed the mother's face. "This boy has asked Amanda to the prom," she began. "Now he calls her all the time." She then added matter-of-factly that the boy was developmentally disabled. He had systematically asked every pretty girl at the school, including several of Amanda's friends, if they would accompany him to the prom. Every one of them had turned him down, sometimes kindly, sometimes with a cruel eye roll. Seeing all of this go down, Amanda made a decision in advance that she would say yes, because, as her mother said, everyone should have a chance to go to prom. When I heard this story, I started crying at the table, and damn it, I was totally not going to cry today in recounting it to you. But as I sat there at the table, I was wondering, would I have had that kind of moral courage as a teenager? And I answered, no, I'm sorry, Boyd, to disappoint you. And, what would Jana do? I can tell you what I would have done. I would not have been cruel to that boy, but I probably would have avoided him, or maybe I would have, thank you, maybe I would have asked a friend, quick, ask me to prom, so that I would have an excuse if he came to me. And as I sat there at the table, I was ashamed of myself. I did not grow up Mormon. Amanda's decision did not come out of nowhere. It emerged from 16 years of painstaking indoctrination into the idea of choose the right, letting personal moral choices act as witnesses to belief. Amanda had spent her childhood learning to be virtuous. All this was geared to prepare her for moments precisely like this, where the rubber met the proverbial road and she had to decide the best way to live out her faith. I have started this research on Mormon millennials in part because of people like Amanda, because of her example, and because I learned many years later that Amanda left the church. I don't know all of the details. I know her parents were completely bewildered. They did not see that coming. But Amanda's decisions as a Mormon, and then as not a Mormon, have been shaped not only by her family and her church, but also by her generation, the entire cohort of young adults who surround her. Amanda is a millennial. What does that mean? Thank you, Boyd and Brian, for giving me the opportunity today to have you be the test audience. I have never spoken about this project before in public, so this is a great chance for me. And I'm just at the cusp of this research. But there is enough data already out there, in addition to the data that I am hoping to collect quite soon, about what we know about the millennial generation as a whole, what we know about Mormons, and where we can hazard a couple of guesses we might be in 20 or 30 years. So in this talk, I'm going to briefly lay out 4 things. The millennial generation in America, what we know about people who are in the 18 to 35 age group. Second, some of what we know about Mormons in America, including what we know, which isn't a lot, about change over time. And we just saw some great examples of this from JB. Third, what we know from research about adolescents and young adults and religion in America, focusing specifically on Mormons as a subset of the data from the National Study of Youth and Religion. And from all this, I hope to quickly, number 4, raise some questions, offer some very preliminary observations about the intersection of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the millennial generation going forward. I don't, however, have a crystal ball. So I'm going to warn you at the outset that I have a lot of data here. I'm like, a historian let loose on all this data is like kid in the candy store. We never got trained to do this, so it's very exciting for me. We're going to go through it at a really rapid clip, though, so I hope it's not death by PowerPoint for you. This first image gives you the basics of some of the terminology that I'm going to be using today, comparing 4 different generations. The first here on the left is the silent generation, born between 1928 and 1945. So this is just following the greatest generation. The silent generation was too young to fight in World War II, but they had childhoods that were shaped by the Depression and the war often. Many of our Mormon church leaders are of this generation, as we'll see in a little bit more depth later in the talk. Second are the baby boomers, who got their name from the baby boom that happened immediately after the war, when GIs came home from the service and began to start families in record numbers. Baby boomers are those born from 1946 to 1964, and as you can see, this was the largest generation to date in terms of the number of births, and it has set the tone for many things that have happened in the last half century in our country, from the music that America listened to the media habits that we acquired, and even the therapeutic approach that we now use in regard to religion. Generation X is a smaller group sandwiched between the boomers and the millennials. Gen Xers are born between 1964 and 1980. This is my generation, so you might think that that would make me inclined to say automatically that it's the best, but that's not what Generation X does. We are very skeptical about such things. We were the first generation of latchkey kids in the United States, and the first to embrace technology as a way of life. And finally, the generation that we're going to spend the most time on are the millennials, born in the 1980s and 1990s. So whereas my generation, X, was the first to decide to embrace technology, we actually remember a time when technology as we now define it did not exist. Not so with millennials, who have never known life before the internet. Whereas my generation has been skeptical of institutions, millennials, as a rule, are not hostile to institutions. This is not the baby boomers, saying death to everybody over 30, right? But there is a sense in which institutions are largely irrelevant. They are the most racially diverse and the least religious of any generation in American history, the most likely to obtain a post-secondary education, and the least likely to marry young. So I want to look at all of those characteristics in a little bit of depth, starting with race and the changing face of America. The silent generation that now runs the LDS Church, along with some of the baby boomer generation, came of age in a very different America than the one that millennials now take for granted. In 1960, as you can see, 85% was white. Is there actually a pointer? Is this? Yes. If there's anyone who might be able to help me with this, it would be great. But you can see here 85% of the nation in 1960 was white, 10% African American, and 4% Hispanic. Other racial categories at that time were so small as to be statistically negligible. Half a century later, in 2010, when the millennials were young adults, thank you. Woo, yay. So here we are at 2010. When the millennials that we now have were young adults, whites were 64%. African Americans have grown slightly to 12%. Hispanics have quadrupled to 16%. And there is now a category of Asian Americans at 5% and a category of other, which is interesting and includes people are self-reporting. And so sometimes this means that they are representing multiple categories at the same time and don't know which one to choose. But look at what's going to happen in the future. This is in 2060, by the time that today's millennials are retiring, what the demographics of our nation will be looking like. We have 43% white, which is half, roughly, of what it was in 1960. We have Hispanics as the second largest group at 31%, and then African Americans at 13%, Asian Americans at 8%, and other at 6%. Notice that there is no longer a racial majority of any kind in America. What we have is a racial plurality. This is what will be happening over the next decades. Let's take a look at marriage. The graph reveals the age at first marriage for members of the 4 different generations. By the time the members of the silent generation reached their early 30s in 1960, almost 2/3 of them were already married. Every generation's age of first marriage has dropped since then, from between 10 and 17 points to the point where only 1/4 of millennials are married by their early 30s. In a few minutes, we'll also see some Mormon statistics to be able to determine in what ways and to what degree these statistics are holding true for the Mormon people. But the most important thing here to note is just 26% of millennials will be married by the age of 30. Generational trends in the workplace have also changed significantly. So comparing the silents to the millennials, there are some huge changes. When the silent generation was this age, so when they were in their 20s and 30s, early 30s, 78% of the men and 38% of the women were in the workforce. Those rates for male employment, as you can see, stay pretty steady at 78% up until the millennial generation when they drop to 68%. Where we see the really big changes are with women. So 38% of women were in the workforce when they were young, in the silent generation. It went up to 69% for my generation. You're welcome. And then has dipped a little bit down to 63% for millennials. So millennials have grown up in a world in which women in the workplace is simply part of life. That is simply a given. Millennials economically, you see from this drop kind of a hint of this. The reason that there is a drop, partly it's because some are in school and that's not included in the data, but it's also because some millennials have kind of dropped out of the traditional work patterns. Many are living at home so much that their baby boomer parents have coined the term the boomerang generation, that the children of the boomers don't quite leave home until quite a bit later. Okay, so let's look at religion, which is the major focus today. And millennials are the most religiously unaffiliated of any generation in recorded US history. I remember in 2012 being at the Religion News Writers Association meeting where Pew came and presented this data that had been embargoed. And we were just stunned, to see these numbers suddenly, 20% of the United States having no religious affiliation, and 32% of the under 30s having no affiliation. And then just 2 years later, Pew followed this up with another study on the same thing to find that both of those percentages had increased. So now 23% as of 2014 are nuns, and 35% of those under 30 are nuns. So this is more than 3 times the percentage of nuns that existed during my childhood. I grew up in a nun family in the 1970s when it was not cool to be a nun, and it was certainly not common in the small Midwestern town where we lived. So I guess you could say that my parents were a generation ahead of their time. So some of the Pew data on religious affiliation by age I think is interesting. So look down here to see 9 out of 10 people in the silent generation are affiliated with an institution, an organized religion. Here you see 32%, yes, 9 out of 10, that should be here. 67% of millennials are affiliated and 32% are not. It's a huge change over time. What's particularly interesting that you don't see here is that when you break out millennials into kind of subsets of a generation, with younger millennials being the ones who are currently in college or in their early 20s, and then older millennials in their late 20s and early 30s, it becomes really clear that this is not going to be a trend that is stopping anytime soon. The trend toward religious disaffiliation is actually stronger even in the younger millennials than it is within their same generation with the older ones. Just to be clear about what we mean by nuns and religious disaffiliation and what we don't mean. Specifically, I do not mean that nuns do not believe in God. Okay, nuns are not atheists. Some don't even say that they're agnostic, which is interesting. The third line down the chart here, I'd like you to look at the belief in God. So 92% of the silent generation believes in God, 84% of older millennials, and 80% of younger millennials. That's actually very interesting continuity between generations. Where you start to see the divergence is in these questions of practice. So only 39% of millennials say they pray daily. These are the younger ones. 28% attend services weekly. Remember, this is always self-reported. There's always an institutional generosity that happens when people report, yeah, of course I attended church last week. Sometimes sociologists might say it's as many as twice the number of people who actually went to church will tell you that they went to church. So that's very interesting. But that's true for every generation, not just millennials. You also see a dip in the number who say that they believe in God with absolute certainty. So silent generation, it was 71% who felt that certainty. Millennials, it's exactly half. But there's still very strong reporting of belief in heaven. In fact, there's even a strong reporting in this generation of belief in hell, which you might not necessarily expect. The percentages overall for practice, religion on the ground, are very different for millennials than they were for the silent generation. Okay, that's the end of part 1. We've talked about the millennial generation as a whole. I want to talk briefly about what we know about Mormons. First thing we know is that Mormons are a very young religious group in America. I don't mean young as in that we were founded in 1830, although that makes us young, but young in terms of the average age of our members. Anecdotally, the truth of this comes home to me every time I have to do an end-of-the-year accounting on my blog for my employer on which posts were well-trafficked. I really like writing about genealogy. Apparently, my readers don't like reading about that. What they really enjoy are things about pop culture, about the minions, seminary questions, which reflects their very young age. So here we see a pretty high percentage of Mormons in the 30 to 49 age group, and then in the 18 to 29 age group. Together, this makes 62% of Mormons are 49 and under. It's really high, which you can see when we compare that to other religions in America. So Mormons don't have the highest rate of people in that 18 to 29 age group. The Muslims do. But when you put those two things together to get 62%, and you put some of these other religions together, it becomes really clear that Mormons are a youthful religion in the United States. The other groups that outstrip Mormons in terms of youthfulness are Muslims at 81% of those two groups, Orthodox Christians 66%, and Buddhists at 64%. Mormons are the only group in there, though, to not have a very strong immigrant population that is driving that youthfulness. So in terms of groups that are primarily people born within the United States, Mormons are very youthful. All right, socioeconomically, just briefly, this is interesting comparative data because we see what's happened here with a large middle class among Mormons, and then we had the ones below $30,000 a year, the ones above $100,000 a year, and then a growing income inequality. This is not just Mormons. What they're tracking is that this is happening all across the nation. The poor are getting poorer, the rich are getting richer, and the middle classes are squeezed. Now, in Mormonism, it's down to 53% instead of 59%, as it was just 7 years before. And since in Mormonism, the middle class has been kind of the bedrock of the ideals promulgated by the church, this is interesting and potentially problematic. All right, marital status by religious group. Actually, I'm missing a slide here. All right, I wanted to show you that with Mormonism, 66% here, okay, 66% of Mormons are married. And if you look at this, according to all of the different religious groups, who's coming out on top? Yeah, so Mormons are tops in the number of people that are married overall. This is from every generation, okay? And if you were a church leader, you would probably be feeling really great about that. You would be congratulating yourself because 66% in today's climate is an amazing statistic on marriage. But when you compare it to what the Mormon situation was just 7 years ago, something different emerges. Here in 2007, we see that 71% of Mormons were married. Now it's 66%. It's a drop of 5%. It's still within the range of maybe just being a statistical blip or statistical noise. But given the trends in marriage or lack of marriage in the rest of the nation, I kind of doubt that this is a blip. I think actually that this is statistically significant, and it will continue if what we know about the millennial generation is as true of Mormons as it is of other people. So moreover, there has been a drop in parenthood. This is a stat about the number of parents who have children under the age of 18 who are still living at home. And you can see a drop here from 49% to 41%. Again, that's kind of a lot in a short period of time that Pew is measuring, especially when you consider what we just saw about how young Mormons are. If 66% of us, or 62%, help me out here, are 49 and under, that's exactly the age of people who would be having children still at home. And yet we're seeing that drop as Mormons report what's going on with their own families. Okay, just a couple more brief observations about Mormons in general. The first is that the racial composition of Latter-day Saints in America, considering the marked shifts that have happened in all of these other ways in what's going on, the fact that there's been almost no change at all racially is very interesting. 1 percentage point for whites, 1 percentage point fewer whites, 1 percentage point more Hispanics. I think probably this is well within the range of possibly statistical noise. So about the same. There's been almost no change. And you saw earlier how much our nation is changing and how rapidly it's changing. Among Caucasians in America are losing about 2% a year. So the fact that Mormons are not is really interesting. But that's not to say that there hasn't been any change at all among Mormons and what they think. So 2007, 24% of Mormons disapproved of homosexuality. This is not same-sex marriage, but just homosexuality in general. In 2014, that goes up to 36%. And that's a 50% increase. That's actually the largest, sharpest increase in this same period of any religious group in the United States. So although with just 36% approval of homosexuality, people saying that it should be accepted, Mormons are very much on the low end of religious groups in their approval. The overall American rate of approval is 54%, or it was in 2014. That 12-point increase is the sharpest jump that we see of any group. So Pew did not break out the information about homosexuality by age group. I suspect that if they did, we would be seeing that a good deal of this increasing acceptance is driven by the millennial generation within Mormonism, that they share, probably to a lesser degree, but at least in part, their generation's overall emphasis on inclusion and tolerance. However, lest you think that Mormon millennials are just liberalizing willy-nilly, take a look at this chart, and if you were at the politics session yesterday, this will not be a surprise. This is about party affiliation, and you can see that the party affiliation among Mormons overall is increasing, 65% here to 70% are leaning Republican, would vote Republican. And among younger Mormons, it's actually even a little bit stronger than that. And Dave Campbell and Quinn Monson and John Green, who by the way was not the John Green who wrote The Fault in Our Stars, in case you were wondering, have done some really interesting research about that, saying that older Mormons over the age of 65 are less likely to favor the Republican Party, 51%, than Mormons under 30, which is 69%. So 69% is very high. All right, what else do we know about young Mormons? This is part 3. This is drawing on data that Christian Smith did in about 12 years ago, research that he did. We know that LDS teenagers, the generation who are now young adults, were very devout. As teenagers, they were far more likely to pray with their families, to attend youth group, by which in the Mormon context we would mean as young men and young women, and to abstain from sexual intercourse. And for all this, they were lauded in a number of books as leading the charge in adolescent religiosity. You can see here highest rates of Sabbath keeping, evangelizing, and fasting, which turns out to not be a very popular practice among young people, teenagers in particular. My favorite part of this data is that 43% of the Mormon teenagers said that they would go to church every week if it were their own decision, and no one were forcing them. It's like, God bless them, everyone. That's so awesome. So when this research was first published, the Deseret News and some other publications the Deseret News was like beside itself in crowing about the religiosity of LDS teens, who tied for first place with Black Protestants in ranking religion as very important in their life decisions. What's even more interesting is that when Christian Smith and his colleagues did a follow-up study several years later, Mormons also came up trumps for these teenagers, these same people who were followed, turning into what he called emerging adults, so very early cusp of adulthood. So Black Protestants, Mormons, and white evangelicals scored the highest in whether they expected religion to be a very important part of their adult lives going forward. Mormons scored the highest of any religious group in wanting to marry someone within their own faith tradition. They had the most positive view of the role of organized religion as a force for good than any other religious group of their generation. And overall, they had the highest rates of reporting that they had become more religious since adolescence. So think about the timing of this. When they're doing this follow-up in early adulthood, this is exactly the time when Mormon young men and women might be heading out on missions. They might be attending Mormon universities, or at least institute in the university or college where they are attending. They might be in a singles ward for the first time. They're pretty well connected at a time when, famously, young adults simply drift away. All right, so what do we know about Mormon millennials by generational trends? How much do they assimilate of what is happening in the rest of America? And I think the answer is pretty complex. So to recap, on the one hand, there's this. Mormons, like the rest of the nation, are delaying marriage, having fewer children, and are waiting longer to have those children. Like the rest of the nation, we've seen a sharp rise in Mormons who are accepting of homosexuality. And like the rest of the nation, they're increasingly caught in the squeeze that is affecting the American middle class. Unlike the rest of the nation, in which the millennial generation has voted solidly Democratic in every presidential election they have been eligible to vote in, Mormon millennials are becoming more Republican, not less. Millennial Mormons have no apparent loss of religiosity, as we just saw in that crucial transition from adolescence to early adulthood. And they're resisting the trend in that Mormonism continues to be fairly racially monolithic compared to the rest of the United States, not diverse. So this is a fairly complicated picture. I warned you at the beginning that I don't have a crystal ball, but I'm going to do a little bit of speculating and mostly just raise some questions. The number one question that I get asked and that other people seem to be asking themselves is, are more Mormons leaving the church than ever before? Is it true that many young adults frustrated by the church's conservatism on issues like LGBT equality or women's roles are simply voting with their feet? Are they drifting away because their testimonies were shaken by learning new and unsettling facts about LDS history or doctrine? Many of us know stories told anecdotally along the lines of 1 in 3 returned missionaries will eventually leave the church. Those seem to fly in the face of some of these more hopeful statistical findings that seem to show Mormon young adults scoring very high, not just in indexes of personal religious belief, but also practice. So like I said at the outset, I'm just beginning this research. So we can all take this with a grain of salt, right? Good? Okay, but here we go. So according to Pew's research, 64% of people who were raised LDS self-identified as LDS as adults when they were surveyed, which means that 36% did not. This is interesting. 64% is not bad at all. When you compare it, Mormons are looking right smack dab in the middle of all of these other groups in terms of retention. And if you drill down more carefully, Mormons are one of the 2 groups, including evangelical Protestants and ourselves, that are not also having an ethnic component to holding on to a religious identity. It's a lot harder if you grew up in India and immigrated to the United States, or your parents did, and they were Hindus, to say that you're no longer a Hindu, because it feels, according to how people report this feeling, that they are repudiating their family as well as their faith that they were raised in. So 64%, given those parameters, is actually pretty darn good compared to other religions that have more of a voluntary component. So much better than mainline Protestants. In fact, the thing that really strikes me actually about this data is what happens to the ones who leave. So take a look here along this line. 6% of them are becoming evangelical Protestants, 3% are becoming mainline Protestants, and a little smattering of other things. But 21%, right, are not embracing anything new. Okay? That is very interesting. It's almost as if, having been raised in a tradition that told you all your life growing up, this is the one true church, even when you leave that tradition, you're not interested in shopping around for other faiths. Most of these people are not replacing institutional religion with something else, they're simply leaving organizational faith altogether. Again, we looked at marriage statistics and saw how hopeful it was that Mormons have this very high rate of marriage, and then we looked at what it used to be. The data on what it used to be is mixed here. There are some studies that show as many as 90% of Latter-day Saints up through the 1970s and 80s were retained to be Latter-day Saints as adults and self-reported that way. I'm a little bit skeptical of how high that is, but if those results are accurate, then the LDS Church is looking at a very significant statistical drop. It is certainly no greater and actually smaller than other religions are looking at over the same period, but it's still a concern. The number of people who used to cling to the religion of their childhood is different than the number who do so now. So it may be true that Mormons are doing better than many other religious groups in retaining young adults, as Christian Smith and other researchers have shown, but that's not the entire story. If we can believe those findings about what the standards were a generation ago, even one generation ago, then retaining only 64% is a problem. I'm going to talk very briefly about a few things that Mormons are doing that are genius in retaining young adults, and a few things that may be questionable, if that's our goal. But I want to say at the outset that there's only so much we can do. When you are in the force of these prevailing generational changes that are so huge and important in the United States, we need to stop thinking in this very insular way that it's only because of the things that the church is doing or that the church is not doing that young people may be leaving. They are part of a generation, and generations have a pull all their own. The religiosity, the increased religiosity that we saw with previous generations, and certainly the silent generation with that very high percentage of both belief and practice, well, that was generational for them too. Their whole generation is like that. It's not just Mormons, that's who they are. And Mormons in the silent generation were just as affected by those trends as millennial Mormons may be now. And those trends are very hard to resist. Okay, that's not to say that some of what we're doing doesn't play a role. So let's look at a few of the things that we are doing that are great. And the first is that studies are showing that still the number one reason why people stay in a religious tradition is because of the influence of their parents. They call this religious transmission, as though it's a disease that you are, passing along to your children. You have successfully transmitted your faith. So the longitudinal faith and families and faith study by Vern Bankston at the University of Southern California demonstrates that far from being irrelevant, parental influence remains the single most important factor in deciding children's eventual religiosity when they are adults. Comparing the degree of religious similarity between parents and their young adult children in 1970 and 3.5 decades later following the same people up to 2005, Bankston's team took measurements in several key areas, including religious intensity, religious affiliation, and frequency of attendance. What they found, they were shocked by, which was no change, virtually no change from 1970 to 2005. And given the other sweeping demographic and social changes that occurred over the same time period, as we have seen, that's not what we would perhaps expect. Children were still generally following their parents in regard to religion, perhaps a little bit less intensely, but generally they were still following their parents. So Mormons, with our heavy emphasis on child rearing and inculcating the faith, just last week I was in Fast and Testimony meeting, and a woman got up and said how important it was for her that her children saw her get up in testimony meeting and heard her testimony, that the most important thing in her life was to be able to pass that along to them. And according to research, that is the best way. To model your faith for your children is the best way to pass it along to them. So a second thing that Mormons are doing right, and I know you're going to groan if there are people here, is the singles ward, okay? We take it for granted that singles wards exist, but many other religions have nothing like this. And so their young adults are trying to navigate that very sharp and sudden transition between childhood and adulthood without that support network, without that kind of transitional phase. One of the things that we know about the millennial generation that they respond to is that they need work to do. They don't want to just sit there and be passive receivers of adult wisdom. They want to be out and doing things. Give them work to do. Naomi Schaefer Riley has a brilliant book, Got Religion, in which she follows a number of religious traditions as they try to retain their young adults. And she singles out the singles ward as a very successful means of transition. In a singles ward, with the exception of the bishopric, usually almost all of those leadership positions are held by young adults. And they are learning how to be adults. They are learning how to have responsibility and knowing all along that it's not just window dressing. Without their work, the congregation would not function. It's not simply pro forma. So in response to a generation that at least allegedly dodges adult responsibility, Mormons challenge millennials to take up the mantle and to lead. In response to a generation that is delaying marriage to an unprecedented extent, a situation that also has a bearing on religiosity because there is a high correlation between rate of marriage and religious activity, singles wards encourage Mormons to meet and to marry. In response to a generation that regards friends as the new family, singles wards provide young adults an instant family of their peers. And in response to a generation that thinks locally, the ward model in general places Mormons in traditional neighborhoods, which lines up well with millennials' predilection for acting, living, and socializing on a hyper-local basis. Because Mormon wards are assigned geographically, or in the case of singles wards, both geographically and by age, Riley says that the paralysis of choice is largely removed from young adults who are deciding about church. This is an important factor with a generation that is having a hard time with commitment and making adult decisions. For Mormons, the question is not the overwhelming question of, oh, which church do I join? But rather, do I go to the ward or not? A third reason why Mormons are successful, and you all already know this, is that there are very explicit, strict instructions on how you do this, on how you are growing in the faith throughout childhood and then into your transition to young adulthood. I'm not going to dwell on that. Okay, possible problem areas, given what we know about the millennial generation and where we are with Mormonism. How can we do a better job of holding on to young adults? So the first thing is the leadership structure of the denomination as a whole. This slide is from before 2015, but a lot of the information is still the same, so I'm going to use it. And you can imagine that there are 3 new apostles there at the bottom. In the LDS context, we don't have any kind of official mechanism outside that ward level that I just spoke about, where young adults are at least mentoring and in charge of one another. We have no mechanism institutionally for young adults to instruct and be consulted by their elders. And this is a little bit of a problem. We do not listen well to our young adults. We don't give them positions of authority over anyone but each other. And at the general level, when decisions are made in Salt Lake City, they're not included. We have gone in a radically different direction from the church that was founded because a 14-year-old boy didn't, like many teenagers today, like any of the religious institutions that were staring him in the face. But the church today has become an institution that is run as a gerontocracy by people 2 to 3 generations removed from the age that Joseph Smith was when he founded it. The millennial generation is coming of age in an LDS church in which the most prominent leaders are older than they have ever been before. Millennials have never known anything different, so they think that having almost every apostle be eligible for Medicare is the norm. But historically, that's not the norm at all. The last half century is the outlier. It isn't simply that apostles, like most Americans, are living longer than ever before. That's a factor. But it's also that we are waiting to appoint them as apostles another 20 to 30 years in their lifespan before they get called. Thomas S. Monson, who is currently the president of the church, called to be an apostle when he was 36. Boyd K. Packer called at age 46. And then we see many of the most recent callings of apostles are of people in their 60s. There are some exceptions, like Elder Bednar was called in his early 50s, Jeffrey R. Holland was called in his early 50s. But overall, we are trending upward in the ages at which we call these apostles. Now, why does this matter? It matters because young adults feel disengaged, and they feel like it's hard for the leaders of the church to relate to them. They're the first generation of Mormons to come of age with church leaders who could be their grandparents, rather than their parents' age or even their own age, being called to positions of great authority. I don't think that the structure of the church is going to change, and I'm certainly not advocating for that. I'm just pointing out that the way that this is going is becoming increasingly alienating. I got an email after General Conference this year from a friend whose daughter asked her, why don't we have youth speakers in General Conference? We have them at the ward level, we have them at state conference, but there's never a youth speaker. Maybe youth sing in the choir, but other than that, there's really no representation of anyone under 50. It's a really good question. That seems like a very easy cultural practice that we could work on. So what other ways might we be alienating a little bit? I'm not going to dwell on this, but some factors that we see are important to millennials, the things that they say that they value. One of the number one things is authenticity. Well, the number one thing is authenticity, the sense of things being genuine. This makes it a nightmare for marketing purposes. If you're trying to sell things to millennials, it's really tough because they can sniff through anything that's prepackaged, anything that is a little too slick. They want authenticity. They want people to be vulnerable with them. They want people to admit weaknesses and to be human with them. Millennials value innovation and risk-taking, which is not necessarily what we see in the general trajectory of the LDS Church. They value interactivity. I have a slide here of Elder Bednar's Twitter, who he follows on Twitter. And I think that the apostles, if they're going to be on Twitter, they ought to do it right. I did a blog post recently about evaluating, and this is really cheeky, but evaluating their Twitter accounts in terms of sorting them into kingdoms. So in order to qualify for the celestial kingdom, I mean, I'm a liberal, so I set the bar really low, right? All you had to do to qualify for the Twitter celestial kingdom was to post at least one piece of non-recycled Twitter-specific content over the last year. Guess how many apostles passed my test? One. 5 of them had at least tried to post content on Twitter, But for many of them, it was that an intern, presumably, had recycled little snippets of general conference talks, and without any context or additional information, like the apostle saying, I was thinking about this today because of something that's happening in the news, or I was reminded of this. Nothing. It's just, broadcast media, essentially. It's not social media. It's broadcast media, just vomiting it out there for other people to consume. And, kudos to Elder Rasband, can I just say? Shout out to him. He's the only one of the apostles who at least tried to be interactive. He retweeted someone's question for him. He answered a question on Twitter. Gold star. Okay, why is Twitter important? Why does that even matter? People say Twitter is just irrelevant. You're following Why My Cat Is Sad, which actually is hilarious. But Twitter is relevant. Twitter is important. If it's important to this generation, it should be important to us too. We need to be there, and we need to do it right. We need to take the time to do it well and to communicate, to be interactive, and not behind a wall. Mission and passion, I have no concerns about. We've got plenty of both. This is wonderful that we lowered the age for people to serve on missions, for example. I think it's fantastic in what it offers young people. A global perspective, I would say we get a mixed result on this. We have a number of wonderful things happening globally. We are an international church. We send missionaries so many different places, and yet we don't see this global perspective represented in the upper echelons of leadership. And that is something that's important to millennials. Remember, they're growing up in the generation that is the most racially diverse in our history. There it is, racial diversity, gender equality, a broader perspective on the family. So briefly, okay, in the 1960s, 5% of live births were to unmarried women, just 5%. Right now, it's 42% of births to unmarried women. So the kids being born today are 8 times more likely to be born in a situation where they have an unwed mother than the kid in the 1960s. What does all this mean for Mormons? And this question that we've been debating about boundary maintenance in the church. We might look at the statistics and see that the church is trying to hold the line on what it defines as the traditional family. This new reality of 42% of children being born outside of that ideal is not great news for the church. It's hard, though, if you are among that 42%, you're growing up and you come to church and you hear week in and week out somehow that your family is less than. It becomes alienating. Maybe you think your single mom is awesome. Maybe you think that having 2 dads is better than 1. That's not the message that's being reinforced in church. I'm not making a statement about our theology. That's above my pay grade. But I am making a statement about how people are affected by that belief and how this might be one of those examples we were talking about in the last session where we're trying to maintain this balance between having a distinctive message and then also being appealing to the mainstream. The mainstream now, not the same as it was 50 years ago. Not even close. Finally, optimism. This is one of the most optimistic generations we've ever seen. It's wonderful because they're actually broke, but they all say, I'm going to have enough money someday. I mean, I totally love that about this generation. Final slide. I've been very influenced by Armin Moss's work, The Angel and the Beehive, and you've probably heard that referenced a couple of times here. It's this idea that we live in tension as Latter-day Saints between retrenchment and assimilation. What are the hills we want to die on? What are the things that are absolute do-or-die issues for Latter-day Saints that we're going to go to the mat for? And what are the ones where we want to be enough like our neighbors that we're willing to give things up? Right now, we're experiencing both those trends of assimilation and retrenchment simultaneously. So millennials are growing up in a world, or coming of age in a world, in which, as one millennial put it to me, the church giveth and the church taketh away. He was referring to the churches making assimilationist strides for LGBT equality under the law, but then in November changing this policy about LGBTs within the church and their children, that they would be unable to access the waters of baptism. The church giveth, the church taketh away. We can expect that tension to become a pattern in the near future, perhaps especially so for millennials whose generation is so much more socially liberal as a whole than the generations that have come before. The church's message is strong, and as we've seen, parents' message is even stronger. But at the end of the day, we are all of us creatures of our age, and that also plays a significant role in our trajectory. So as I continue my research into this fascinating generation, it's such a privilege to be able to talk to them, to have them trust me with their stories. And Amanda, the young woman that I mentioned at the beginning, want to give you an update that she contacted me on Facebook and mentioned that, to her surprise, all of her peregrinations seem to be leading her back to the church. She's going to give Mormonism one more try. Thank you.